out and doesn't jump from questions about what's good to question about what's true. Okay, that's what's animating the value-free ideal. But how, so challenges that. First challenge is something that's often called the descriptive challenge. The challenge here is that when we look at science that is actually published in the best scientific journals, that is generally regarded as good science, not something where people have committed any frauds, not something where people have been callous and have made mistakes or jumped to conclusions or anything like that, but something that's clear, that's considered by normal scientific standards good science, then these non-epistemic values still play a role in closing the gap between data and theory. So here, there's a general point that the theory is underdetermined by the evidence. You need to use some background assumptions. And that, when we look at the actual science, that's closed by backgrounds. As this gap is closed by background assumptions, whose choice is in fact value-laden with these moral and political values. And this has been especially feminist philosophers who have pointed out that when we look at those things that are actually published in scientific journals and so on, they are full with value judgments that, for example, are very chauvinistic, that in primatology or in lots of parts of biology, the female have been treated as if they are submissive by the very nature. There was no real evidence for that, and it's just been published anyway, that the focus of all the research is about, in evolutionary biology, is about what the males do, and females haven't really been looked at. There's very great, by a feminist philosopher of science, very interesting book on the evolution of the female orgasm. You might be trying to find that. It's kind of interesting to see that she argues that the research on that question, why do women have an orgasm, has been driven by a lot of sexist sort of assumptions. So when we look, but it hasn't published in top scientific journals, but still it's full of various values that people have used. Okay. Now, so that by itself, of course, shows only that values do in fact play a role. It doesn't show that they need to play a role. Those philosophers, and a lot of them are feminist philosophers, who argue that the value-free ideal is not something we should accept, also argue that sorry, I forgot to say something. And some people make that argument that actual science always uses values. They might make this argument that it's not really possible to do science without that. And so therefore, to say that it should do that is kind of an empty thought. So this is what I mentioned earlier, and I wanted at this point to return to that. So I'll just do that here. Okay, so but they make another point too. And they point out that this problematic inference that we discussed earlier when I talked about, well, we move from I want it to be the case that children are no more susceptible to the virus than adults, to it's true that they're no more susceptible to the virus than adults. That problematic inference doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that value-free ideal. It doesn't follow from rejecting that inference, which is indeed bad. So that inference is problematic because it's a kind of wishful thinking, or it's a way where the value judgment drives the inquiry, the scientific research, into a predetermined conclusion where it's, well, I already know what's supposed to come out and I can just like try to find that result. That's problematic, but it doesn't follow that value, non-epistemic values should play no role. We can still, those who use that descriptive challenge, they argue that, well, there's still lots of ways in which can play a role. When should you stop a line of research? When do you have enough evidence that this is useless? Just move on. When can you move on and just study something else? What kind of further data do you need to consider? These are all questions where values can come in, and it's not there. You use values, but you're not using them to jump to a predetermined conclusion. And so I think first, it's not really possible to not use any values at all. Second, it's possible to use them in a way where we're not jumping to a predetermined conclusion. Okay, so I wanted to point out one example where values in a problematic way arguably play a role in scientific research. And so where you see, well, we need something to use to come from evidence to theory, and values seem to play a role, in fact, in good insight. So and to illustrate that, in fact, it's playing a role. So this is research from the 2000s from Simon Baron-Cohen and his colleagues. And that it looks at fetal testosterone levels and how that influences brain development and certain scores, emphasizing and systematizing scores. Okay. So they basically let people do various tasks, and that they classify as either emphasizing or systematizing tasks. And there are men and there are women. And then there are people with autism. Okay, and then you look at, well, do you have a high score in emphasizing? Then you'll be in the upper corner, in the yellow corner, or do you have a lower emphasizing score in the lower left corner? Do you have a high systematizing score? Then you're on the right hand side, and so on. Okay. Now, when you look at this data here, you see that it's actually pretty messy. Okay, so there are men and women are mixed. The women tend to be a little bit more on the right. Sorry, the men tend to be a little lower emphasizing and a little higher on systematizing. The females tend to be a little bit, let's see, females high in emphasizing, lower in systematizing. And autism is, autists are low in emphasizing, relatively high in systematizing, though they're pretty widespread. Okay, so the reason I wanted so this is called by them in this paper, the emphasizing systematizing hypothesis, where fetal testosterone levels influence brain development. And they then summarize this theory that there's a female brain and a male brain. The female brain is predominantly hardwired for empathy. The male brain is predominantly hardwired for understanding and building systems. Autism is a result of, these are quotes from their the book or the paper. So actually two different things. Autism then is the result of an extreme male brain. Okay, so the data are very messy when you look at this. And there's various questions you can ask about this. How exactly was emphasizing defined? How exactly was systematizing defined? What drives this? Is it socialization? Is it indeed fetal testosterone level? All these extremely messy things, they get all pushed aside to this simple theory: there's a male and there's a female type brain, and it's driven by testosterone. These feminist philosophers point out these are questions of values. So these are questions where someone uses values in a problematic way to in their research, and that's unavoidable. They ask certain kinds of questions, define things in a certain way, and that's unavoidable. And we need to do it in a morally and politically good way, and not in that problematic way that you see, for example, here, where we sort of support a theory about the intrinsic differences between men and women. Oh, so people like Helen Longino, you see here, then think that idealized science is not characterized by being value-free, but by being guided by values in the right way, by being socially organized in the right way. So what's problematic with this Baron Cohen stuff is the way this is guided by values. Good science is one that's responsive to criticisms, where there's public fora for debate, where scientists share values with various in various ways. They're not fighting about values. Values can play a role, but they need to play a role in the right way. Now, this concludes this descriptive challenge. Douglas, Heather Douglas, the author of this article, points out the problem with this. Well, this might show that values play a factor role in science. It's not really clear that this by itself undermines the view that the value-free ideal is an ideal. It's a normative ideal, how it should be, even though it's not how it is. The point by Levy that we could use this small set of values to jump from the data to the theory could still be used to to make it possible to not avoid the use of moral and political values. And so the point that it's impossible doesn't actually stick. That doesn't seem to work. So it seems like there's a problem with this descriptive challenge is that it's there's some good things about it, because it does show that it asks, well, why is this an ideal? It puts finger at this question, why is it an ideal? Because it shows, well, doesn't this problematic inference that we had, that doesn't itself prove that the normative, the value-free ideal is true. But it doesn't really undermine why, it doesn't really show by itself why it isn't an ideal either. Okay, so we'll get then to arguments that try to show it shouldn't really be an ideal. A second challenge that looks at this more seriously is now to say, well, it's looking more precisely at this Levy, and Thomas Kuhn actually also has this way of thinking about it, way of drawing the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. Okay. Now, we've seen here that that the good science is supposed to appeal to things like simplicity, unity, fruitfulness, consistency. That theory has a lot of scope, can be applied in different areas. And we saw that in Lakatos, we saw that in Kitcher. You might think, and that's what several feminist philosophers especially point out, that it seems a bit arbitrary. Intricate theories, complex, sophisticated theories. Why is that not? Isn't that good? Instead of unity, why we have complex, heterogeneous theories that look at some phenomena from a variety of different perspectives. Just looking at fruitfulness that generates new research. Maybe how about applied science that can actually deliver results that are usable for something. Instead of looking only at consistency, maybe we should look at things about whether the theory is appropriately balanced and takes into account various different angles that one have or something. Instead of looking at scope, that it can explain many things at once, maybe we should look at, is the theory new? Does it bring in a new and interesting perspective? If one calls those things epistemic, it's hard to see why one should call those things not epistemic. They are sort of, close to the opposite. And so it seems like, well, why would one be cognitive epistemic, the other one count as political? So that's an important challenge. Why, if one says that, if one accepts that value-free ideal and appeals only to a small set of values, why those and not some other ones? Now, I have a sort of challenge to this way of challenging the value-free ideal that I want to mention. One might argue that maybe Levy and Kuhn and so on didn't indeed make a mistake in thinking which values they include. Maybe what they should have said is that the epistemic values are all and only those values that have a direct connection to truth, like accuracy. And then we draws the boundary between the scientific and the non-scientific values that are allowed and ones are not allowed, according to the value-free ideal, between values that are related to truth, like accuracy, and those that are not related to truth. That doesn't seem arbitrary. So anyway, that's something to think about. Now we get to a last challenge, and that's maybe the most important and the most powerful challenge. Now we've already talked about this first part of the challenge a few times, but this challenge is really directed at the ideal, the normative ideal. Is it really good to avoid appealing to any political or moral values? So first observation for the challenge is that every scientific claim involves a form of risk, an inductive risk. That's something we already talked about in several different ways. We need to leap to a theory at some point, even though several theories are compatible with the evidence. We can also just state the probabilities, but we'll see some of these, the problems that arise and will also arise for that if it's just state the probabilities. Now, scientific claims should rightly serve as input to society and to make decisions in society. So it's a good thing that science plays a role in organizing decision-making in society. So a well-organized, well-functioning society uses scientific claims and theories, gives them a certain kind of authority in making decisions. So this is what we do with the coronavirus all the time. What decisions Norway makes is influenced by what the science says about it. And that's a good thing. So that's the second claim. That's a good thing. Science should play an important role in making such decisions. Same with other decisions, what climate change and so on. The science plays important, has authority in society. Now, the position of authority that scientists have in society requires of them that they're neither negligent nor reckless, that they're not just like quickly jumping to a conclusion, but also that they're not so hesitant that they never really say anything. So scientists should, if they should have some influence on decision making, they need to make claims neither too quickly nor too slowly. So suppose that Norway is trying to make a decision about whether to open the schools or keep them closed, or whether to close them again after they have been open, whether to open the gyms or close the gyms, whether to allow the cafes to be open or not. They need to ask scientists. If you have the scientists to just well, I don't know yet. I don't know. I'm not sure. We don't have the evidence yet. Then scientists just don't play a good role. But if you just say, oh, we have the evidence, it was all clear, and this is how it is, too quickly, that would also be problematic. Okay, so they shouldn't be neither too quick nor too slow. But then what counts as too quick or too slow, as negligent or reckless? That's not a matter, that's a matter of non-epistemic values. It depends on how important the decision is. So since we need to jump to a conclusion, leap to a theory, and science needs to play a role in society, when scientists just say, okay, now we have enough evidence, that needs that is a question that cannot be closed just by pure scientific values. Now, note that this is accepting that a crucial premise here is that science needs to play a role in society-wide decision-making. So when, for example, Jeffreys says that scientists just assign probabilities, that's all fine. But then if they only assign probabilities, then they're not really doing their job either, because that's going to make it very difficult to use these theories in any decision making, because then others need to use that in say, well, okay, substances probabilities, that's enough to do something about it. Just appealing to simplicity and so on is not going to tell us when to open the school. Is the evidence good enough and so on? It's not going to tell us. The scientists need to tell us, now we have enough evidence. They can. That's a job of science, and they can do that job only if they use values. Okay, so it's a normative challenge. So I'm going to illustrate this with an example. Suppose you have a friend or a friend of a friend, say, who comes over for dinner and asks you, are there peanuts in this dinner? Okay, they ask you, are there peanuts in it? Now, you might say then, no. And that might be jumping to a conclusion. Suppose the person is allergic and would die if there were peanuts in it. Then I think it would be not appropriate to say, on the basis of the evidence that the pack that you didn't put any peanuts in, that it really hasn't have any traces of peanuts in it. That would be inappropriate. You would say, actually, I don't know. I don't know that there are no peanuts in it. By contrast, your response might be completely appropriate if the person is just curious because they cannot like peanuts and wishes her friend made the peanuts in the dish. Then I think it would be appropriate to say, well, yeah, I know there's no peanuts in it. I'm sorry. So this illustrates that whether some evidence is good enough to say that I know will often depend on what's at stake. And what's at stake is a question of values. So sum it up. Good science should be a good informant for policymaking. Which evidence is good enough to accept our theories in this way so that it serves as an informant for policymaking depends on what's at stake. It's like in the peanut case. That is a matter of non-epistemic values. So that's the normative challenge to the value-free ideal. Now, these types of valuation where you decide it's good enough, they take place in many places in scientific practices. A scientist needs to decide, going to use a method that leads to quick results, or we're going to use one that leads to stable results. Then we're going to use a method that's going to lead to results right now, or only in 5 years. Should we now look for more data, or should we start investigating something else? How should we describe the data? We can say, well, we can describe the data in a way, for example, just say, well, there's a pointer or a clock hand that pointed to the right-hand side. We can do that for all scientific describing all the experiments in this way. It would be very, very boring paper. Or we could describe it in a more theory-laden way. We say, well, the PCR detected evidence of the virus in the patient. But you might think, well, that's a little bit less safe. Maybe the machine was actually not really detecting it. Maybe there's something wrong. These are all kinds of decisions that need to be made by scientists to come up with a claim, and values are going to need to play a role. Question about what is at stake? How certain do I need to be? Okay. So then this is saying that if science is to play a good role in our societies, then it needs to make value judgments, because it needs to at some point decide that a theory is true. It cannot just leave it with probabilities and not decide when is it the point reached when we have enough evidence. It needs to employ non-scientific values. It does it in many different ways, non-epistemic values. Okay, now I want to end with a challenge to the normative challenge. So that maybe the role of science in society actually forces to at least aspire to the normative, to the value-free ideal. And that challenge comes from the philosopher Du Bois. He's an Black American philosopher working at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Had many interesting things to say about democracy, had many interesting things to say about the philosophy of race also. And he argued also about the role of science in society His view is a sort of kind of defense of the normative ideal. That's a normative defense. It says that the normative, while the normative ideal, in a certain sense, we can never be completely value-free, scientists should aspire to it. And that's because of the role of science in society. So he disagrees with this idea that the value-free ideal is wrong because science needs to play a role in society. It's sort of in the point that science should aspire to. So this I have this from a recent paper by Kofi Bright. Okay. So here's what he says, and this is about scientific works on race. So it says the frequent alliance of sociological research with various panaceas and particular schemes of reform. Particular schemes of reform has resulted in closely connecting social investigations with a good ideal of groundless assumption and humbug in the popular mind. There will be at first some difficulty in bringing the Southern people, both black and white, to conceive of an earnest, careful study of the Negro problem, which has not back of it some scheme of race amalgamation, political jobbery, or deportation to Africa. The new study of the American Negro must avoid such misapprehensions from the outset by insisting that historical and statistical research has but one object, the ascertainment of the facts as to the social forces and the conditions of 1/8 of the inhabitants of the land. Okay, so what is he arguing for? He's arguing for, he's saying a lot of the sociological research about the conditions of African Americans, the Negroes, as he puts it, it's so political that has led people to just not believe in it. They just treat it as humbug, bullshit. The only way out of that is if scientists try to just keep to the facts and not appeal to any values. So he is saying that that maybe it's impossible for scientists to be completely free of political values, but if scientists, we should aspire as scientists, or scientists should aspire to a value-free ideal so that the public will trust science. And because only if the public trusts science, then science play its proper role in democratic societies. We want a perception of science in the public where science is thought to be value-free and then can serve as a neutral arbiter in decision-making. And that role it can play only if scientists try to keep the values out, even though maybe it's impossible. Okay, so that's sort of is about this. So this then really interlinks the question, can science be value-free, with the question of what is the role of science in a democratic society? And so we'll get to that in the next weeks. A final sort of question that I want to pose to you is, when we look at the role of values in society, whose values count and who should be involved in the decision? And that's going to be something we talk about a lot for the next weeks. What should we do research on? How much of the research on it should we do? Which methods should we use? Is the evidence good enough to accept the theory? Who should be doing the research? What should be doing with the results? These are all questions that are broadly within science that at some point we're going to appeal to either epistemic or maybe epistemic and non-epistemic values. The question is whose values should count. And so this is something we'll talk about when we talk about more about the role of science in society. Okay, thanks a lot. And look forward to talking to you about all this.